Let's start with the Lions. This is a team that
Listen,
we've talked about ad nauseum throughout the offseason, but I think we can't really talk about with any degree of certainty until we start to see proof of concept, like two new coordinators. There's a lot happening here. There's some changes up front on the offensive line. You got a chance to see it up close. What were your takeaways from Lions practice?
yeah, I mean, I think the first one is it's still a really talented group. You know what I mean? Like it's when you're there, it sticks out. And I may have said this on the podcast on Tuesday, but the amount of players that are in year 3, year 4, year 5 that are still ascending, and like it's really easy to find guys in that roster where it's like that guy's a really good player and he's still going up. Aiden Hutchinson, Brian Branch, Jamison Williams, and they believe he's in for a very big year. Sam Laporta, like there are players, Aleem McNeil, there are players all over that roster that are already really good and are just kind of hitting the sweet spot of their careers. So I think the hope is that like that becomes a little bit more of a player-led group. I think defensively, they did so much to groom Kelvin Shepherd to be Aaron Glenn's replacement. I sort of view it a little bit like you remember the transition from Robert Saleh to D'Amico Ryans and how that. I mean, it was harder for the Niners when they went from Ryans to the last 2 years, right? Like to Steve Wilkes and then last year, this is, I mean, to me, this sort of feels like solid to Ryans and that they've really been grooming Shepard. I'm fascinated to see what happens going from Ben Johnson to Johnny Morton. I think Johnny Morton's very capable of doing the job. I think one thing that's interesting about it, a couple of people have pointed this out to me, is how Ben did a lot of stuff on his own,
Yes.
And a lot of that offense was, and this, you've done a lot of reporting on Ben, a lot of the offense was very specific to Ben. It wasn't like part of this bigger scheme that you see across the league. It was very specifically like Ben Johnson's offense,
Yes.
And so I'm fascinated to see like how the Lions handle that. Do you try to replicate that? Does it become something different altogether? I think one of the reasons why Johnny Morton was the pick is because he was in the quarterback room 3 years ago. So he was with Ben, but my understanding is a lot of that offense was, all right, like on Monday, Ben disappears and he pops out Wednesday with the game.
Correct.
The week,
Yes.
And it was sort of like Mike McDaniel-ish that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like in that, like, I think it'll just be interesting because I don't think this is one of those like, oh, well, this is a part of a big family of offenses and they'll be all right because there's this foundation in place. It's just a little bit different than that because of how specific everything was to the way that Ben did things.
I always likened it to that episode of The Office where Dwight was fired and they had to try to go into his computer, but each of the file folders were unlocked with or password protected with a different mythological creature's name. And that to me is like you trying to figure that out is like trying to figure out what Ben was doing because no one knew what Ben was doing. And I felt like I was screaming it from the rooftops when everyone was talking about the Ben Johnson succession plan, and it's just like, oh, Tanner Engstrand's gonna do it, and Tanner is now the offensive coordinator of the Jets, and he left with Aaron Glenn, and you just keep it in the family, but it's like you can't because you really don't know how it came together, and we really don't kind of understand the mechanics behind it, and so while I do think there's an uphill climb for Johnny Morton, I was interested in your takeaways from practice in the fact that you see Jahmyr Gibbs taking another step and being even more of a do-everything player. Ben Johnson was getting there. I think that was always Ben Johnson's idea. What interests me is whether Johnny can kind of conjure that, whatever it is, that thing that made Jahmyr Gibbs so good last year. Because I remember watching them during training camp the year prior. And no offense to David Montgomery, but when Jahmyr Gibbs is on the field, especially when they were doing joint practices with other teams, it was another world in terms of complications that a defense had to face. And your hope is that they can channel that and continue to channel that because as star-studded as this offense is, I really think that Gibbs is sort of the focal point to me.
Yeah. And I think they expect Jamison Williams to take another step.
Which is interesting because he was on the almost like people were talking about trading him this offseason.
Right. So I think part of that, and we'll see what happens with him. He's going to be an interesting one going forward because it's like how many mouths they have to feed, and they're already paying St. Brown what they're paying him, and so what does that mean after this year? I think that could get really interesting. But Jamison Williams had a really good offseason, a really, really good offseason, from April on through. But yeah, I think Jahmyr Gibbs kind of he's like the Marshall Faulk of that offense now. And, they were doing things with him and lining him up as a receiver in the spring and teaching him the route tree, which is more uncommon than you think, that's a really tough thing to do with the running back when you're talking about how you divide up his time. So, yeah, I mean, I think the idea that a guy could have like 1,900 scrimmage yards and comes back and is more than he was the year before is really, really interesting. And we'll see what Johnny can do with him.
So I want to relay this to fans of the game, listeners of the podcast. Every offseason, you will see area running back, I'm working out at wide receiver. Yeah. And then you're like, wow. And you run to your computer and you put the guy in the first queue for your fantasy draft. And then you're like, what the hell? It's, week 7 and he's got 11 catches. And there's a difference between those erroneous reports that are just like players will just say stuff, or team, or you'll just be working on pass catching drills, right? And and I think that some of that stuff gets conflated during training camp versus Albert saying Jahmyr Gibbs is learning the route tree and that he could end up being Marshall Faulk. That's a real thing. Jahmyr Gibbs is actually learning the route tree and could be Marshall Faulk. Whereas who am I thinking about? Like Travis Etienne, like how many years in a row, or like Najee Harris.
Etienne, when Urban drafted him, it was like Etienne, like didn't they initially were going to use him as a receiver, or he's going to be, he was going to be is that he was going to be Percy Harvin, and that didn't really work out. Yeah,
and Jalen Hurts was going to be Taysom Hill. We know nothing at the end of the day, know. But I can promise you that this is a really shitty year for me not to be able to keep Jahmyr Gibbs in my dynasty league. So you can't keep the player that you kept the year before, and I drafted Jahmyr Gibbs, so I had 2 years.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It's kind of just a bad situation there. Dan Campbell is not putting the pads on yet, which is just slightly disappointing. I think, Detroit Lions, kind of like Metallica, you got to see it live. You got to see it with the pads on. So hopefully at some point, I will say this about that place too. Like, I don't think the program's affected much. Like, I think Dan's still got that thing rolling. And I always use this. You talk about the pads. I always use this as the best example of who the Lions are. And I remember you were really high on the Lions last year, coming into the season. And I remember when I really got behind you on this, which was like after I went to their training camp. I remember seeing I was there for a very physical practice last year, and they scrimmaged, and the refs were there and all of that. They do the kind of game scrimmage things in training camp. And like when you've been to enough training camp practices, when there's a hit, when you almost know there's going to be a fight that's going to erupt, right? Like there's a hit that happens, and you're like, here we go. And then before you know it, half the team is in the scrum, There were like 3 or 4 of those in the practice I was at last year with the Lions, and nothing happened. It was the guy hits the ground, the guy who hit him picks him up, and they go back to the huddle. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, this team is like, you know what I mean? Like that's like, this is like standard operating procedure for this team. You know what I mean? Like, and it was a team that like, I remember I said this to Dan after the practice. I was like, you guys look like you know how to practice. You know what I mean? Like, and I really saw that with them. And I think it's just an interesting thing to see, like that you had that element of, they're physical, they're tough. They beat the crap out of each other at times, but they also understand what the whole thing is and have this bigger picture in mind as players, which not everybody has.